I remember having this conversation once with two really unlikely people. One was a scientist and the other was an archbishop. And they both said, yes, in this case, they both said the problem with journalism is that you have the wrong conception of time. Everything is about what's happening within the 24-hour news cycle, and so you miss all of the things that matter, right? And so one of the things I want to make sure that we do in this session is try and understand what happens over time, what's for 2023, what happens in the years out from there. There's a natural follow-on from the conversation that Luke just led around cybersecurity. Rachel Youngman is the chief executive of the Institute for Physics, which Tom and I were just saying is like a proper title. That's really cool, isn't it?
A confession to make.
Yes.
I'll hold it.
Okay, great. That's great. And Tom, yeah, you can confess.
Exactly, thank goodness.
And Tom Hurd had one of those kind of government careers. Bex, do you also work in this world where you move, as far as I can see, from sort of one impossible problem to the next? So it's counterterrorism, and then it's cybersecurity, and then it's biosecurity, and then it's all forms of human security. It feels they've got more and more difficult, and did all of that for government, and now set up this really interesting firm called Zeki Services, which, if I understand right, is trying to identify where the real intelligence is, who's the talent in that world. And Chanda Velu, who I hope is joining us, also, by the way, has a very cool title, which is a professor of innovation and economics at Cambridge. Chanda, thank you very much, or professor, I should say, thank you very much for joining us. Rachel, can we start and sort of get tucked straight into it, which is this session is about quantum and the economy. And I suppose what we're aiming at here is where do you see the real world applications and how we should think about those?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I mean, the first thing I should say is about my confession. I am not a physicist. I'm a sort of self-taught geek, which physicists tell me is not a recognized qualification. But nonetheless, I love all things physics, so I come at it from that perspective. I mean, I think there are a few things around this. I mean, the first thing, it was interesting to listen to Elias and Erica in particular, because they touched on one thing, and that's sort of society. And I would say that society is quite some way from understanding what quantum brings and what it means. I mean, everyone maybe has heard about it, but I think the actual understanding of it in application, and that's purely because of where it's been at, and it probably hasn't been at the stage of becoming understandable to people, but I think it's now starting to get there. So I think there's an enormous, and we feel this at the Institute of Physics, and I'm sure others do, there's enormous kind of responsibility on us to really start explaining this in a way that is understandable and is clear. And it's interesting to see there are sort of picture books, but I rather like the idea of that. And so that seems like the right move to make it much more tangible to people. And I don't think yet that has really come to life. I think the other thing we have to be a bit careful about is when we talk about society, we talk about it as a thing, and it isn't actually. It's lots of different things, and it's lots of different things to different people. A lot of people in society, we know, if we look at things like, well, everyone's interested and worried about climate, actually the reality is, and there are plenty of polls to back this up, they're not. What they're interested in is putting food on their table and worrying about their bills, and it may be their energy bills, but they're not necessarily associating that with the type of work that's being done to find those solutions to climate. So I think there's a lot more work to do before we get to the point of society really understanding some of that.
I suspect you're right. By the way, I love your confession about not being a physicist. When I joined the Financial Times, Martin Wolf explained to me that there were only three kinds of people at the Financial Times: economists, proper economists, and serious economists. And so,
yeah,
I know how you feel.
It's a bit like the Institute
I was
of
none
Physics,
of those things. Yes.
Don't tick any of the above.
But Tom, I wonder whether you could just talk us through. It feels as though we've actually got the kind of contours of different interests here. So one of the subjects that's come up is, okay, what's what's government interest in quantum. We've talked a lot about not getting fixated on that, not getting fixated on security, because you're seeing these big private sector interests, fertilizer, carbon, hydrogen, etc. And then, as Rachel says, there's a whole kind of society impact here, which is probably further down the line. But can we just do the first of those? If you cast your mind back to being in Downing Street and you were thinking about this room and this group of people and thinking about what the real world government applications of quantum would be in the next decade, how will you prioritize them?
Most ambitious governments around the world now want to describe themselves as a science superpower. So they see science and data as a new lever of influence and power globally, alongside diplomacy, military and economic levers, which are the traditional ones. You look at the government's integrated review, it's the first time that there was a whole new pillar of influence and leverage, and it was called technology and data. And the ambition is for the UK to be a science power. Now, this comes down to language. So what do you mean? What do you mean by being a science power? But it would then translate into language like we want to have quantum advantage or quantum relevance, which is lower than advantage, and then others would talk about quantum supremacy. But I don't think that they will need to define that more clearly, because the quantum community in the UK still needs a demand signal from the government. It is still relatively immature as a market and as a community, and the government is still going to be a major participant in setting the direction and creating the ecosystem within which the quantum community will thrive. They will produce very soon a new quantum strategy, and that will define, I think, then what they mean by in terms of their ambition and how they want to get there. I mean, people have talked a lot about today the technology and the national security implications of that, and I won't re-rehearse that. The other area that the government will be very interested in, as I know from the work we're doing with them, is they want to know about talent. They want to know about whether they have the right talent in the UK to deliver on quantum ambition. How do they retain that talent? How do they attract talent? So again, any good self-respecting national quantum strategy will have a big block around kind of talent. And I can talk in more detail about what our findings are about the talent in the UK.
Yeah, do.
It's a good news story, I would say. We have mapped and ranked the quantum community globally using a very broad range of analytics. But the UK entered a period of rapid growth from 2012 in the amount of quantum-related researchers that it is producing. When we rank the top 500 institutions in the world, the UK research institutions in the world, the UK has 5 of the top 30. Only America has more, but many more. The UK has a breadth of expertise across all quantum disciplines, both hardware and software. And one of its great strengths is that expertise and talent is diffuse. So other countries, particularly China, have a very narrow infrastructure on which they're building of research institutions in which they're building out their quantum capability. The UK is very diffuse, and that has been one of the reasons why I think it's been able to grow more rapidly, because its infrastructure is more expansive. But gender diversity is a real issue, but there are some very interesting talents. I mean, Ilias was talking about quantum music. I think, Ilias, you have Eduardo Miranda working for you, who's one of an exceptional, interesting new talent in quantum, and he's a quantum musician. I think he did the first ever concert in the metaverse. So we have some very interesting talent, but the talent at the top of the pyramid is very different from the talent at the bottom. The ones that are coming through have much different expectations and profiles and diversity than you get at the top. Globally, the USA is pulling ahead, just miles ahead. China is basically late starter, lagging, will not catch up the Americans based on just sheer quantity and quality of talent. And if you look at the big multinationals who are IBM, Google, Microsoft, they would all rate in the top 30 globally in terms of research kind of muscle and quality.
And geographically within the US, where is it clustered?
East Coast. It's East Coast, not West Coast. So it's Maryland, not surprising. NASA and the NSA are down the road. So that's Duncan's point, and it's MIT. Now, it's not to say that it isn't on the West Coast as well, but it is stark how much the talent is concentrated, and the best talent is concentrated on the East Coast.
And the 5 research institutions in the UK?
Oxford stands out. It's the all-rounder across a whole range of disciplines, has some of the best performing, best talent, best potential talent coming through. Cambridge, UCL, Imperial, Bristol. But I would add Southampton, if you're interested in photonics. They knock it out the park on photonics globally.
Let's come back to that, because I think that has some impact on where things go. Chandra, what's just listening to what Tom was saying there about talent, the US, what's your read on how what we're talking about moves from the theoretical and the projected to the real and the practical?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think I agree with Tom that we do have great talent here in the UK, partly because we've had a long history of investing in the science as well as the engineering. I think one of the areas where looking forward, where talent needs to be further developed is based on our work. A lot of the experimentation, particularly around quantum computing and quantum communication, is taking place more or less in the, let's say, the chief technology officer's domain or the R&D domain. And the challenge I think that we face is how do we communicate that to senior management who may or may not necessarily be conversant in some of the technical aspects of quantum computing or communication. And I think that's where the talent need to be developed, so to speak. We need to have an education system that educates the middle and senior managers on the potential customer value proposition. What exactly is the benefit, how the benefit may unfold, why is it important for firms to begin to invest today? And I think that's the area where I think we will need to develop the talent. And if we do that, then there'll be much better pull through, I think, from the strong science and engineering base that we've got into the business domain with leadership being shown in this area.
And Charlie, can I just ask you a question? Historically, companies have not been very good at deep science investment or R&D, for the obvious reason that you go to them and they say, can we spend in this year's budget and we might get something back in 5 to 7 years' time, maybe. How does quantum fit in to that real world?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely, and I suppose quantum is no different from any other, I suppose, new technology in that context. And I think what's really interesting is for senior management to really understand that this is potentially game changing. However, I suppose as any new technology, firms would not necessarily want to invest unless one is able to demonstrate there's some immediate or at least some shorter term returns to the technology, and therefore you incrementally invest, so to speak. But in that context, I think what is important is really to think about quantum as an option value, i.e., we don't really know precisely what the possible new value propositions are going to be, but at least what will be useful is if we can demonstrate that there are some short-term gains so that firms begin to invest in the technology to buy the option to be able to explore new areas, so to speak. And I think that's the context in which quantum needs to be positioned within firms, and that would get the buy-in and the incremental investment that is needed in order to really take this forward. And once firms see the key benefits, they're going to start investing more significantly, and therefore there'll be a takeoff. So I think is that option value that's very, very critical here.
Yes, sorry. Thank you. Yes.
I'm Molly, and I work in a media strategy company, and we have lots of quantum clients. And in terms of talent, one of the things that we talk about a lot is diversity, and the fact that the people who create quantum technology now will determine who benefits from that in the future. So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about talent and recruiting is apprenticeships and how they will increase in importance, and how you don't have to have a PhD in quantum physics to have a career in quantum. So that's something that really interests me. So I find your confession more of an accolade than a confession. So just from obviously a Cambridge professor and from very kind of a diverse panel in itself, have you seen that, or do you think that will be important in the next decade? Apprentices, school leavers, you know, in a wide range of quantum disciplines.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I have to say is that we've done quite a bit of research, particularly with quantum companies in the UK, and most of them tend to be. It's lovely to see Orca as well. Most of them tend to have started off as SMEs, and particularly the S of the SME bit. And what we have seen in our research is that there is a skills problem. And over the last 5 years, over half of those companies have been holding back on their R&D and innovation because they can't get hold of the skills. Whether the skills are there and they just can't get hold of them, so they're not flowing through into the right places, whether we haven't got enough, I think there's a bit of both of those, and I can touch on that. But we're certainly seeing that companies are struggling, particularly with those physics-based skills, those specialist skills. After that, it tends to be the data analysts. As high demand, but interestingly, quantum is finding it more difficult than other physics-based businesses. So there's quite a difference there. It's not entirely clear. I could infer things from it, but it's not entirely clear from the data. Others might know why that is, but certainly quantum does have a bit of a talent problem at that SME level. I think in answer to your question about diversity, you're absolutely right. I mean, over half the skills that are needed in the country when it comes to physics, and obviously I'm talking specifically about physics, are not degree skills. They're not academic. Over half are those technical skills. So I think that makes an important point. I think the other thing, and physics, and I'm sorry, because we have to confess that we're really bad at this, and it gets us into trouble with the engineers because of our follow through to engineering, is that we don't have the diversity. We know that that's a problem for not enough girls coming into physics and going through, but it's also other underrepresented groups as well. So that is something we really need to address, because the impact on that, and Ilias and others mentioned about the sort of whole thing of ethics and the responsibility of quantum. Obviously, what you do want to see is diversity of the people working in it. And we can't, as physics, we can't say that we are able to produce that at the moment. So there is a problem there.
Rich, will you just talk through the 70-30 point we talked about a little earlier on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a stat we use. And it was interesting, your reaction to it, actually, that in England, so this is just England, that 70% of physicists come from 30% of schools. And I was interested, you said, oh, that's maybe not so, but I mean, we are a little ashamed of that, actually, that it's a very high, don't congratulate us on us at all.
No, but the reason I was interested in it was that, you know, someone sent me that you know, that I'm sure you've seen that tweet which went out after Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, which had universities that our Prime Ministers have come from since the war. It's one or none, right? Oxford or none, it's like something bizarre. Yeah. So we have this massive problem in the country, which is excess concentration in terms of kind of pipeline. And so that's the reason why the 30-70 is interesting to me, which is, where is that 30%? And sort of, so how do you expand it? That's the thing that's interesting to me.
I think there are a lot of things that go into that. one of the most practical things, which I'm sure people are probably aware of because it's talked about a lot, is that there just aren't enough physics teachers. And so those teachers tend to be concentrated in certain areas. So it's not unusual in, certainly if you look at lower socioeconomic areas, that there are no specialist teachers. So, obviously that impacts a number of people going through to the post-16 qualification. That's the cutoff point. We need to get more people thinking about physics post-16, whether they then go off and do other things or whether they go into an academic pathway or technical or whatever it is, but there is a drop-off point at that. So we need to address that. So the teachers is a very practical point, but I would say actually that's much wider than that as well. And that brings in the way sometimes that physics is perceived by people.
Stuart, you want to make, sorry.
Can I comment on that question?
Yeah.
Quantum companies, small quantum companies in the UK hire where they are located, and invariably the center of gravity of that is the university. They don't tend to look further than that. They predominantly hire still physics postgrads. Whilst certainly American companies, which may be a little bit more mature at the moment, further down the road, hire more engineers, or more of a blend of engineering as well as physics. 30% of quantum talent is kind of outside the G20, and that's historically been the case for 20 years, and it's never really been tapped. So I think there is something about companies going beyond the purview of their immediate neighborhood to build out their talent. The reality is they don't know where the talent is to be able to do that. That's why we exist, but that's basically, they just don't know where to look. The diversity point is a big issue, but and I think that we need champions of diversity. So I'm not advocating for this particular individual. I don't know this individual, but I'm very inspired by her, who is Professor Leah Lee at UCL. Amazing talent in quantum sensors. Leah Lee. Right. Knocks it out the park academically, has a side hustle as a tech consultant, started her own company 2 years out of university, had to get the money mainly from Switzerland. Her big thing, her leadership, which is very visible and very active, is in racial equality and diversity inclusion. And I think she's a real inspiration, actually, but very, very different, So I think we need to bring people like that up and give them more profile. Frankly, we need to give people like that a lot more money, basically, at this stage in their career, not further on. Stuart, sorry.
Yes, Stuart Woods, Oxford Instruments. No offense intended. We don't need to, for the quantum economy, we don't need more physicists. I mean, we also need, plumbers and electricians, to be honest, to really make quantum computers work. I mean, we have 37 open recs, and very few of them are quantum physicists, to be honest. And that is part of the key. We need the STEMS program. We need people that are curious about car maintenance, electrics, plumbing. A lot of building the quantum computer is, coax cables, right? And continuity of electricity or thermal conductivity or thermal transfer, right? So these are really basic functions that exist in cars, right? So we need to really expand that to look at getting over the stigmatism of the word quantum and getting people interested in it in different ways. I think that's part of it. The other thing is we've got to solve the problem of free movement of people within countries of like-minded, countries of like-mindedness, and the ability to move between, freely between the UK and the US is a problem, right? We need people here in the UK. They're all going to the US. We need to be able to do the same from the US to the UK.
Sure, thank you. Can I just, sorry, do you want to say something, Luke? Yeah.
Just before we get too far away from it, Tom, in theory, you've got a counterpart in the US somewhere who has a history in government and is doing the same sort of analysis and overlooking the talent economy in the US. And whilst you've found that the US are worlds ahead in certain ways, I can bet that that person is saying, we've not got enough. There's not enough. We're not doing enough. What does that tell us about, I mean, first of all, do you agree? Maybe, perhaps not, but what might that tell us about actually the sort of the demand for this future-facing technology essentially being unsatisfiable?
So I'm not sure there is somebody in the US. There is definitely somebody in China, definitely. And I think it's just it's too blank a piece of paper. I don't think people actually understand where the talent is and how it moves around in order to embrace it more and hire it and retain it. I think this is a big issue because it's not just UK and US. Who's going to pick up all the Russian talent that's leaving Russia? Who's tapping into the talent in Africa, let's say, which exists. There are good physicists and engineers in Africa. People don't know who they are, so they can't go and find them. So I'm not sure. I think the Americans are so far ahead of everybody, but it doesn't mean that they're any further ahead. Actually, I think that's the issue. I mean, you look at American companies are massively more overcapitalized than British companies, massively. I'm not certain that yet is delivering any better science. There are other people who are in a better position than that, but for all I hear, they haven't got any more qubits than anybody else. So, but I think they, as the point is made, they will be hiring different talent going forward, and therefore that's the thing. And I think it's in the engineering space, which which is where they'll grow, and computing and computer scientists coming over much more into this space in the future, as they will into other science disciplines.
Did I hear your name right? Is Bex?
Yes, yeah. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of your points. I think it seems as though in the UK we actually have an amazing natural diversity, and I think our legacy, our sort of heritage is very innovative, we're very creative. I do think we have that as sort of a natural asset. In sharp distinction to China, which I'm fascinated by your analysis, which finds very developed but actually very narrow. And so the kind of message I think from all the sessions is there is strength in diversity, and that creates a huge sort of natural resilience, which is true in all natural systems, which quantum seems to sort of mimic in a beautiful way. So it feels like actually our problem is very basic, like it's education and it's pipelines at a very early stage. And I'd love you to comment on that. And why can't we fix this? And is it all government's fault? And secondly, is there something that you could comment on, Tom, in terms of China and the digital Silk Road, which might create an advantage by tapping the resource of Africa in particular?
And Chandra, I'm going to come to you in a moment.
I think the first point, and it slightly gets back to, sorry, I've forgotten your name, but it gets back to your point as well, that immediately anyone says physics, they think of postgrad or professor. And actually, what we need is people to think about studying physics at 16. You don't necessarily need to go on and do it after that. You go on to all sorts of different careers. But I think that post-16 qualification, it brings so many different skills. I take the point about needing plumbers and all sorts of other people as well. Of course, it's the blend of skills. So physicists aren't the only problem. But I think the trouble is that as soon as you mention physics, people immediately do jump to it being a very academic discipline. And that's part of its image. It has that image. So I think, in answer to your question, there are things that hold people back. And obviously I am looking at this from a physics perspective, but it's one of many skills. What we don't see is, young people don't see, is the career opportunities. They're just not clear on what those are. And I think we could, as a society, do better at explaining what the different jobs are and what the pathways to those jobs are, and not put them off at a very early stage that we have this incredibly complicated ecosystem, and to do this you've got to be brilliant and you've got to come from, you know, sort of the 30% of schools, otherwise forget it, you can't do it. Because if you do that, certainly from our perspective, you are forever going to be fishing in a very small pond. And that's not necessarily where you want to be. So I think there is a society piece. There is a piece for government, certainly, and there are some things that government can do in terms of investing into teaching profession, and not just the recruitment, but the retention of teachers. That's a big subject because it happens across lots of disciplines, not just physics. But I think there is also a society piece of getting better, and something for the quantum community as well, of what are these different jobs and what qualifications do you really need to be able to do this? And then, as Tom was saying, to show where the exemplars are as well, because there are some great role models out there, but unfortunately they're not always the ones that are front of stage, and maybe we need to do better with that.
I think we talked actually in another case in the technology discussion about quantum networks. You know, we will, you know, people to succeed, I think, you know, countries or companies, preferably together, will create quantum talent networks, because they will need to choose and open the pipelines and give great Rwandan scientists visas to the UK and fellowships and things like that, and things like that. So I hope in the new strategy there'll be a lot about alliances. There are two industries that are worth looking either side of quantum, which have gone in very different ways. So the photonics industry in the UK is worth £14.5 billion to the UK economy. So that's more than the pharmaceuticals industry in the UK. It employs 75,000 people, but it's highly fragmented. There's no unicorns. None of us know the name of any photonics company. So it's essential. It's critical enabler.
Something really bad here.
Yeah.
What is a photonics company?
Well, photonics is about light. It's about, you know, harnessing the sort of power of light. It's optics. It's it underpins communications infrastructure, imaging, you know, and bleeds clearly into quantum. It's a great powerhouse in the UK.
75,000 people working in photonics businesses
in the UK, but it's totally fragmented. There's no, there are no unicorns. Southampton University, global leader in photonics, and everything around it. But there's an industry that's become totally, it's very fragmented. There's no unicorns, there's no big players, there's no gatekeepers. And I'm not sure that's where we want to go on quantum. But then on, you know, say in computer science, artificial intelligence, you have the gatekeepers, the people who have the key, you know, the Googles and the Amazons and the Facebooks and things like that. And they are very rapacious buyers of small companies. And I'm not sure we want to also end up in a world where, you know, 4 or 5 companies have quantum supremacy and none of them are British.
Can we, I'm trying to veil. Sorry, I was going to come to you and then
Yes, thank you very much. I think the point about diversity is an important one, and one can look at it from two perspectives. I think there is a technology push story, and there's a market pull story here. And I think one of the challenges faced from the technology push perspective is, I suppose physicists, engineers, and business people talk different language when it comes to quantum. So therefore, diversity is helpful here in order to be able to have a common language, a common set of phrases that can communicate between these different disciplines, let's say, in order to take the technology to market. But I think on the other side, it's also important to think about diversity from a market pull perspective, in the sense that quite often, when we think about new value propositions, they may come from somebody who's trained in, let's say, sociology or in psychology or in economics and so on and so forth, because that's where, you know, when we look at the history of digital computers, it is quite often the people with the different discipline who go and be able to understand customer requirements, how are people behaving, what are the behavioral characteristics, and where does quantum fit in order to improve well-being, lifestyle, economic productivity, and so on and so forth. And I think that's where diversity is important, because thinking about it from the market demand side and then fitting it into the technology push perspective, I think that's where diversity is very, very key. And I think we have got a role, I suppose, at universities, at schools, and so on and so forth, in order to be able to widen the knowledge around quantum across different disciplines. So it shouldn't be just within the science or the engineering department. It should cover other disciplines as well. So we've got a joint responsibility as society to make sure that diversity filters through so that we really get the benefit going forward.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, hi, Tim Gordon from Best Practice AI. If we think about the economic winners from AI, so far they're basically digital data platforms to which you can apply the accelerator button and speed things up and get new things going. Is the winners of the quantum, the economic winners of quantum, going to be a subset or the same set of people, or is there an entire new group of industries that are suddenly going to start winning and transforming because of quantum?
Ilias's point too, and then we'll come back.
No, I was going to supplement I was going to supplement something on the hiring side. So we've gone, it's always good to get some facts and figures to supplement the opinions. So we've gone from about 20 odd people to 200 people. Of those in about less than 2 years, and the vast majority of them are scientists or engineers in the United Kingdom. And I don't see any major issues in continuing to find talented people at the same scale of growth as far as we're concerned. And we are by far the biggest employer of quantum computing and quantum technologies people in the United Kingdom. I think the next 3 or 4 companies, Richard's company and 1 or 2 others, Richard's not here at the moment. I think that they're still measured in dozens of people at the moment. The other thing is we've not had any problems in getting people visas. Hiring somebody who is German or Japanese or from anywhere else, frankly, to work is just as easy as offering a job to somebody in Luton or Watford. So government has been fantastic in helping in that regard. We also have hired very heavily in Germany and Japan. We should have mentioned Japan earlier. I think the depth of talent in Japan is equivalent, if not greater, to the depth of talent in the United Kingdom. Germany outranks all of them, with the exception of China. I don't quite agree with the narrowness of the Chinese thing. Just a separate comment. I think it's very broad and very deep. They happen to have publicized QKD more. And then the only other comment I was going to make, always good to get facts and figures. In the supply chain, there are existing organizations who have swung very quickly into critical supply chain and larger organizations. So we are the largest in the world, actually. I mean, we're bigger than whatever Microsoft have or Amazon have or IBM or Google in quantum. The supply chain for what we build in Colorado, which is a trapped ion device, is all the traditional fabs and all the traditional makers and the photonics, etc. And of course, there is, I know you talk about photonics in the United Kingdom more broadly, but in photonics for quantum computing, which is at room temperature and where the barrier to entry is very low, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of photonic quantum computing companies. Richard Murray's company is one. But of course, PsiQuantum, which is out of Bristol, is another, and they last raised money at $2.5 billion valuation. And I think we just need to be, I mean, the rate of information is so fast in this industry that we just have to always be reminded by a few facts and figures. I was just going to supplement the conversation with those facts.
Ilias, thank you. And Rachel and Tom, do you want to take up Tim's point about, like, is it another world? Is it a subset? Is it a Venn diagram with a group of people in between? I don't know what you think.
I'm not best placed to answer that because I look at it, through one narrow prism.
but you do tend to see all the same big players turning up, you know. So, and again, I can't predict whether they're going to be any more successful than other companies that are coming into the space, like Quantumium. But, you know, Microsoft, IBM, and Google are investing a lot of money in this space. I do not know if it is producing results, but it's certainly demonstrating ambition. Interesting, let's say Google is investing $1 billion in Australia, deep tech talent, which is interesting because Australia has enormous pools of talent. It doesn't really have then a industrial infrastructure to turn that talent into products. So it looks a rather wise investment from Google, and that's a lot of money. So that's all I can give. That I can only give that perspective.
I want to finish up this session, if I might. There are quite a lot of people who I think have quite a lot of reasons to feel quite down about the outlook for the UK. And when you hear this conversation, you'd actually have quite a lot of reason to feel, okay, there's some light here. There's some reason for optimism here. I was really struck last week by the difference between Rishi Sunak's speech on foreign policy and David Miliband's. And putting aside the two personalities or the parties, the one thing that was interesting in the Miliband speech was it had a concrete idea. Right? His idea was we should double the amount of money we spend on intelligence and take it out of the defense budget. Go for $3 billion a year to $6 billion, because we could then be indispensable in intelligence. Right? And if you go back and you listen to Rishi Sunak's speech, it had a lot about the posture of the UK, but it didn't have a concrete policy idea, right? And just wrapping up this conversation, if you were thinking about all the things that we've talked about in this last sort of 40, 45 minutes, you would think if you were government, hang on, there's something here. There is the beginnings of a set of talent clusters and therefore potentially economic clusters and strategic clusters that could be very powerful for the UK. What do I, government, need to do to really turbocharge that? Is it regulatory? Is it financial? Is it, you know, I don't know what might be needed. So I just wondered whether the three of you would give us, if you like, a concrete idea, an idea you can drop on your foot that says, okay, this is how you would accelerate this in the UK.
I would pump money in at the SME level. So because that I think is a perennial problem of, you know, money after the initial idea that can help you scale and not worrying about losing some of that money, because you will lose some of that money. So, you know, PsiQuantum, Ilyas mentioned, they raised a lot of money, but, you know, that money came from the States. They moved a lot of their operation to the States. If you ask the quantum community here, they say PsiQuantum is the one that we regret that got away from the UK. You know, and there were, you know, pros and cons both ways, but that's, you know, that's where they got the big money from. So if there's any way that the government can unlock the gates to making it, you know, to earlier funding for some of the talent and the ideas we have, the better. And just they would have to be prepared to lose some of that cash, like any good venture capital fund. And I think that's a blocker, I think.
Rachel?
I would, you know, I'd take the point about companies that have hired very successfully and the talent that is available, but I would still want to look at that education system, the skills, what we're moving towards in terms of transferable skills, so that we've got the right people in the right place at the right time. I'm not sure the system, the ecosystem we have around education and skills is going to deliver that in the longer term, and particularly for our SMEs. So I still think there is something to look at, and that brings in the diversity part as well.
Charnavelu?
Yes, I think that the strength of the UK would be to really identify some industry-wide problems that quantum computing in particular, together with quantum communication, can really solve. I mean, in financial services, for example, the question of, how do you manage the systemic risk in the entire financial system, and encouraging both the individual investment at the firm level, as well as identifying this really big industry-based challenges, and bringing the different, we've got a very strong base of companies in the UK that play to the strength of quantum computing and communication in the UK, bring them together, try to define and prove the concept of quantum computing in some of these big industry challenges with a systems integrated. Part of it is, how do you integrate the hardware together with the existing digital infrastructure software? And I think doing that would really push the UK to demonstrate the so-called quantum advantage, and then open it up into private sector investment. And I think the second element is that would also identify the real area where scale up can help, i.e. which areas of manufacturing should the UK play to in order to scale this technology up. And I think those are the two things that I would advocate, I suppose. One is the industry challenge, bringing the systems integrator, enabling firms like Quantinum, PsiQuantum, and so on and so forth to play and demonstrate the proof of concept, and then to build up the manufacturing and scaling up capability. I think that would put the UK in a really, really strong position on a global platform.
Okay, well, on that optimistic and doable note, thank you, Chanda, thank you, Tom, thank you, Rachel, thank you, everyone. We've got one final session, which is it going to be as optimistic and sunny? I don't know. In your capable hands, Luke. Okay, quantum supremacy is going to be the final session. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks all.